I will admit that initially I had planned to press you a little bit to explain why you had vowed never to write about teaching writing.
Yeah.
And because you said it for obvious reasons, and I was like, well, maybe the reasons aren't so obvious, and I think you did a pretty excellent job of enumerating them.
Yeah, I used to think, though, that kind of explicit autobiography, in particular with a writer writing about the teaching of writing, the insularity of it, at least in the abstract, really worried me. And I wasn't a fan of academic novels, and the whole kind of sort of literal, kind of direct, kind of insider baseball side of it always worried me. And then I guess it stopped worrying me.
This is not the most elegant thing to do, but there's a part that you skipped over that I really love. It's one of my favorite
I
lines
skipped all the best parts
in the book, which is between the first two sessions, and Fleming goes to, he's just out on the deck, and there's just one line, "Hey, Professor Fleming, there were maybe 5 of them, hovering awkwardly, writers in the sun, just asking to get shot."
You know, I had a serious battle with the editor of the magazine that published that story. They demanded I cut that line.
Really?
Yeah, kept it.
Glad you did.
Yeah.
Okay, that was my preamble. So the first thing I wanted to talk about, or hear you talk about, is the title, which I think is there's a very particular kind of perfection to the title of this book, and why you chose that's the title story as the title.
I was really worried about the title, Leaving the Sea. It felt vulnerable and plain and kind of uncomplicatedly lyrical, but the phrase occurs in the title story when the narrator is lamenting that time in the history of the human species when we ostensibly crawled out of some body of water. When we left the sea to try to live on land, he's sort of saying everything was better before we left the sea, that all our trouble began once we sort of began to kind of walk upright and actually try to have encounters and use language. And so I guess the title stayed because it seems so soft and safe and kind of harmless, and yet when you encounter it in the middle of the book, you realize it's sort of actually saying all of us should never have existed. So I sort of enjoy that it, Leaving the Sea seems, just seems so safe and pretty.
Yeah.
But actually, I think it's a sort of terrifying wish that we've never existed. But then, why is it the title for the book? Are you asking that too?
Sure. If you have something to add.
No, they're just. I actually kept trying to change the title. It wasn't as though it made perfect sense, but nothing better ever came up. And then this cover got designed, which is very oceanic. And then I did sort of try to change the title, and the cover designer said, but it's not going to make any sense anymore. So I sort of felt that it was worth staying with. And I think because it made me a little uncomfortable, it seemed like a good sign.
For what it's worth, I think it makes really good sense, largely for the reasons you're describing. This, I think the whole book, there's this sense of people kind of carrying with them and also being burdened by this, pre-linguistic consciousness that, you wonder if, as you said, wouldn't have all been better off had we never evolved past a certain point.
Thanks.
So I also wanted to talk about, so this is about structure, and as the Ulipo guy in the room, structure is the thing I like to talk about. But
by the way, you're like the youngest by 50 years. You're not just the youngest.
only 10 years.
Oh, is it 10 years? Who's that guy?
But all the famous ones are.
It's all guys, isn't it?
No, there's some ladies.
That should get some kids in there.
That was what they were trying to do.
Were you like 18?
Yeah. Barely.
That's so impressive. So like when you were like 9, did you tell your parents like I'm gonna fucking join that movie? Did you start stalking?
Yeah, let's just keep this going. Yeah. And I moved to Key West, strapped myself to the underside of Harry Matthews' car, and the rest is history.
I can't picture him driving.
Does
he drive?
Not anymore. He's in his mid-80s, but well, there's a really, just to finish this parentheses, there's a really iconic Oulipo license plate that came from his, it's a Florida plate, and it's from his, like, some totally badass Oldsmobile that he used to own. Now it's the crown ornament in the Oulipo archives in Paris. It's just like...
What is it?
Harry Matthews' license plate.
But does it have like some N+7?
No, it just says the word Oulipo.
Oh, it says Oulipo.
Yes, which is
pretty literal.
we never left the sea. But so the way that you put this book together, the way that the stories kind of coalesced into a whole. I think of this as sort of your first book of stories. I know Age of Wire and String says stories on it, but in this there's this like sense of very different parts aggregating into something similar. There's kind of the like defamiliarization exercises, and then there's the like sort of miserablest New Yorker-y fiction, and there's these brilliant Q&A things that I don't even know how those fit, but as it all comes together, like I wanted you to talk about how much attention you paid to like the table of contents and just the order and the structure of it.
A lot. I wanted to lead people into the book and pull them along and have a certain kind of experience, but at the same time I knew that the way I read a collection of stories is often really erratic and irresponsible. I might actually open up into the middle of a specific story and sort of read my way towards the beginning. I read in a kind of terrible and irresponsible way. So I did really try to design the sequence, but I was constantly aware that you can't control how people read. There's a book coming out in a couple of months that's really interesting by Kyle Miner called Praying Drunk, a book of stories, and on the first page it says this book must be read in order. Yeah, and I promptly just defied that order because I guess I think you can't control it. But that said, when I finished the Flame Alphabet, I looked at the stories I had done, and there were a lot of the more kind of, I guess, linguistically dense stories are fairly short, in which each sentence I'm sort of I am doing that defamiliarization, I'm trying to reinvent the usage of certain words, and I had a lot of that, and I realized putting out a whole book of that would be kind of cruel and brutal, and sort of a little went a long way, and so I started to just think, okay, I'm just going to pick the very best of these, and then look at what's there, and then see what's missing, and I realized once I looked at what I had that there were just these really big gaps, like what you call the depressive sort of New Yorker story, or just a story that's maybe a little more plotted, a little bit more kind of formally focused on a character's interior, with language that might be a little easier on the surface, a little more transporting, kind of carry you along a little faster, instead of asking you to get sucked into the particulars of a sentence and get this sort of surgery performed on you and then spit back out. I sort of thought, well, I love reading all kinds of stories, and I couldn't really remember why I'd written off whole sort of aesthetic territories. And I thought, well, what would happen if I try this and I try that? So in some sense, I was consciously trying to do different things, because also I was bored, and I was a little scared that I was just going to kind of keep writing these strange little stories that circled in on themselves and ate themselves and threw themselves out windows, and so I just had to try something I hadn't tried, and so in some sense the book is a result of that. And I'd finish a story, I'd look at what I had and think, well, you don't have a kind of really meditative, discursive story. The story Watching Mysteries with My Mother, that's the title, it's not my real mother. that story was a direct result of feeling like I was missing something a little more reflective and really without any kind of fantastical crutches, nothing sort of strange. I just said nothing otherworldly. No cloth gets stuffed in anyone's mouth here. Everything has to be a kind of here and now, very plain. And so sometimes I was really deliberately trying to, almost maybe like a constraint, saying, I've really covered this other ground so well that what's the area of fiction that actually really scares me, that makes me feel really amateurish and inept? What are the approaches to storytelling that feel like very worrisome, that I can't ever even approach, that I could never do, and then try to do a version of them.
But I don't know how familiar, like, whether the book has had time to settle for you, and like, to you.
It's been out for 2 weeks.
Go back and think about it as a whole. But one thing I think is really neat about what you were saying with the polls that we were discussing is that, like, there are two examples come to mind. Is like in the more realist stuff, there are these moments that initially pass kind of unnoticed. Like there's in the first story, like really early on, the protagonist is getting driven home from the airport, and his sister and her husband are in the back, and there's a comment about how they're almost trying to inseminate each other facially.
Yeah.
And then later in the dark arts, there's talking about Julian licking money from his father's body, and both of these things are like sort of amusingly cynically put, but they don't pass as something that you could get mired in until later on there are like all these other things that are actually kind of similar in terms of the way they're imagined. Like facially inseminating each other could be something that characters do later on.
Story. Yeah, well, thanks for observing that, because I guess I feel in the end we can't, no matter how much we dream of being otherwise than what we are, I can't change I can't change myself really as a writer. I can choose a different toolkit and say, okay, well, I'm gonna try to write something that moves fast through time, or I'm gonna just keep to one narrator, or come up with these constraints. But in the end, it's still my own language and it's still my own sensibility, and in some sense I just became more comfortable with that. Because I think in the world of fiction there are these, I was talking about this with my wife Heidi tonight on the phone, that there are just these funny boundaries, right? There's like a boundary between what we call realist and what we call experimental writing, and these camps are supposed to hate each other, and just there's so many fences up, and in reality it's just the tiniest little slice of the pie that wants to then divide itself more and more and more. And I grew up reading, like I was in college reading Jane Ann Phillips and Ann Beatty and Joy Williams and Deborah Eisenberg and Raymond Carver before I discovered Alain Robbe-Grillet and Borges and Barthelme and Jane Bowles. And so, to me, these sensibilities can actually coexist a little bit. But it's, I don't know, it does seem, the little coverage I've sort of been reading about this book, I see sometimes just like people, I like this, but I don't like that. Or he sold out his experimental roots, or that experimental shit is just stupid. And I don't know, I guess in some sense, to be honest, the book reflects what kind of reader I am. I tried to write the book I wanted to read and failed.
So I'm interested in what you described as a toolkit. Like you can use different toolkits to not to say the same thing, but to kind of express the same writerly presence. And I'd love to hear you talk more about that in general, but I also wonder, do you think there's such things as readerly toolkits?
Yeah, there definitely are. I think it's vastly, hugely uncool to really talk about readerly skill. It seems one is very quickly accused of being an elitist if you talk about a reader's abilities, right? I mean, it seems that when we're writing, we're really meant to reach somebody. They're not supposed to reach towards us. Someone said to me, well, look, would your writing change if all your readers only read one book a year? right? So they really didn't read much at all. And would you still write this dense kind of like crypto, discursive, definitional kind of concept fiction? And it's a really interesting question. If there's no one out there to read it, do you start to change? Or in other words, how much does your perception of your readership change? What you end up actually writing. And forgot how we got started on this.
Readerly toolkits.
Yeah. And I know that I'm a very, I feel that I'm a peculiar reader. I feel that I'm an irresponsible reader. I admitted to someone that even with books I really love, I'll read until 3 pages to the end. I just did this with a book I really liked. And I'm never going to read the ending. I don't know. I just thought, this is good. I'm going to end right here.
Because you're not curious about how it ends?
I guess I'm not. How it ends. Yeah, it's sort of, it had ended already, I guess. Or I think. And I'm not at all bragging about this, but I do think that for me, somehow understanding how I read, really trying to understand it, is a little bit of a key towards what I want to write next.
Understanding that you're one of those, your book ends here, people.
I guess I am. But, The Age of Wire and String in part was, the way I wrote that was, I realized that when I read things, I sometimes would stop in the middle and imagine how they continued. And just, I'd read a sentence and then I would sort of just riff in my head and try to amuse myself, to try to do something funny. And so I was writing inside the skin of another writer. Right? I didn't realize I was writing. I didn't call it that then. But if you're reading and you put the book down and you continue in your head, that's writing. But so that was maybe a really small insight about the way I read that I could then use to figure out what I wanted to write.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
So you made me think of, there's a comment from Harry Matthews in an interview he did a few years ago where he talks about his ideal reader being somebody who finishes a novel of his and throws it out the window, and by the time it lands is already taking the elevator down to the street to retrieve it.
That's nice.
Yeah.
So there's elevators in the buildings.
There's elevators
for readers.
Yeah. I think we can all agree on that.
Yeah.
Do you have, whether as I know I'm kind of crossing.
Do I have a scenario like that?
Well, right. It's sort of muddying the waters.
I picture
here.
Harry Matthews naked on his bed reading whatever I work on. I don't. I guess I don't really think about it. I've never really benefited in any way, or other than making myself nervous and worried and sort of insecure, by really trying to project about other people and the way they might read what I do. I certainly notice after the fact when people are disgusted or bored or repulsed, or I notice if I'm reading and someone's just not paying any attention at all, and I think, is that person's attention up for grabs? Are they just mentally deranged and kind of not of this world? Is there something I failed to do, to capture that person's attention? I think about this stuff all the time, but I guess I haven't found that it then makes me want to pander or want to work that hard specifically for someone's attention, but rather to think maybe what was happening is, I was failing to hold my own attention in the right kind of way in this part of the piece. So I think a lot about that, really line by line. And sometimes if you read to an audience, there's a feeling of reckoning you don't normally get at home alone. And I'll notice, I'll start to skip lines because you sort of feel the urgency of whether or not you have people, whether or not they're listening. And sometimes that's really helpful to realize, oh, I'm being so boring right now. And I allowed myself this at home, where it didn't count. But now it sort of counts. Like it's social suddenly.
Yeah.
And you feel the boredom and you really want to get rid of it.
Yeah. So if that's one kind of, shall we say, generative technique, like, sensing sensing what other people are getting out of it or not getting out of it, just to earn my keep again as the Oulipo guy. What other, like, can you talk a little more about, like, the obvious formal peculiarity in this book is that the title story is a single sentence, or almost a single sentence.
I think it's 4 sentences,
Excuse me.
but it does have a long one, yeah.
And not so much what comes on the page, but like when you are writing or when you are pre-writing, do you find that your toolbox has other things like that?
Well, I don't write a lot, and I don't write every day. But I think when I do, I seem first and foremost to sort of be kind of trying to induce a sort of an experience in myself. But as though I'm kind of designing a drug. I'm doing some little piece of chemical engineering, but it's a sentence. And I'm putting it out on the page and ingesting it again and seeing if it's going to give me the feeling I want to have. So in some sense, I'm sort of my own supplier. I'm injecting myself with something, and if I don't get any feeling out of it, I just can't work with it. I can't pursue it. And at the same time I worry about this, I think, well, is that really all this is about? Because you can scare yourself. You can, take the things you love most dearly and then start to denounce them because it's really upsetting to do that. So there are ways to achieve intense sensation, which I've now learned don't necessarily mean they're that interesting, right? It's sort of a cheaper high, a little bit. So I'm looking for something a lot more complicated and a lot more disturbing and more enduring and more confusing. And, because there isn't a drug out there that I can take that makes me feel the way I want to feel. But actually writing, and certain people, when I read them, I feel it. I feel it with certain writers. And so I sort of think in some sense I guess it's not really saying what the toolkit is, but it's the desire behind the urge to change the toolkit because I want to feel certain things when I read, and so writing is first and foremost about that. And so I want something to be at stake right away. I want something sort of fraught to be put into place. But I say that knowing that I probably will turn on this because I feel like I'm encountering a lot of limits with it, and that maybe soon I have to try something else.
What makes you say that?
I guess because these approaches, it seems really easy after the fact to come along and say, well, this is what I'm doing. I think that writing is far too difficult to have any sort of system work for very long. I think a system can kind of produce a piece or two, a couple of stories, and then suddenly, you're this kind of parrot clown freak who's just sort of trying to kind of keep scraping the same barrel and it's gone. So, yeah, and so, I'm working on a new book and I'm already finding none of those things seem to really prevail. And I have to figure out, well, what will now? And to me, there's a sort of final criteria. I need to wake up wanting to do this, to work on this project more than anything else in my day, in my life. And if I don't, if I'm avoiding it, there's just something wrong with it. If I don't want to rush to it and add to it, add some pages, add some words, then if there's just a sign that there's something lifeless there, and then I think all the time, so how do you shock this thing to life so that I care about it? Because I have too much to do. I have kids I'd rather play with than write, and so I have to think, well, what could I be working on that I'd rather do than hang out with my kids? It's sort of sad. I can do both.
Last thing I'll ask, and then think we can open it up to others, is just how, if at all, your own reading habits change as you're in different places in the lifespan, like the genesis and development of a piece.
How my own reading habits change in relation to what?
In relation to something that you're working on.
Oh. like reading of other people while
Yeah.
I'm working? Oh, I don't know. I don't have that much to say about that. I skim around in things. I read a lot of nonfiction when I'm writing fiction. Somehow, like other people's styles kind of confuse me, and I'm looking for some usually stimulation in terms of kind of content or conceptual stuff, not linguistic stuff, which I might normally get from fiction. And so I read a lot of sort of soft science and anthropology and a little bit of philosophy. I like really simple nonfiction books, like the Oxford has this whole series, a very short introduction to microbiology, and you can read these completely dumbed down capsules of these fields and get a grasp of a completely cursory, but to me very helpful grasp of an entire world I have no access to otherwise. But I don't know that that's changed, because I've always liked to read things like that. I don't really read a lot of contemporary fiction. I develop piles and people are telling me things to read, and I try to look, and I try to always read a little bit, but it takes me a really long time to read like the book of the year kind of book. I'm like always many years late for those sorts of books.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm intimidated by them. So like if someone's saying, this is like the best novel written this year, I feel angry and hurt and scared. Yeah, I don't know, those books with a lot of sort of recommendation behind them. It's frightening.
Yeah.
Do you read all that stuff?
Occasionally, when compelled to, like we're doing the Believer Book Award right
So you
now,
have
and
to read all that.
so I have to at least pretend to have read.
Can you tell us in
most of it.
advance what's going to win? Maybe
No, I
here,
can't.
A little exclusive tonight.
I'm pretty.
Do you guys fight a lot? Is it hardcore? I mean,
Not yet.
I've watched this process as a spouse
Right,
a little bit. I won't say to whom I'm a spouse.
Very Matthews.
I'm not going to say. But so you guys are mostly agreeing? Is there anyone you hate?
There is one book that I really hated.
There is?
On the short list. Yeah.
Is it going to win?
I don't know. I hope not. But I think we've engineered our short list such that anything that wins, we can all feel pretty good about
That's pretty good.
representing.
That's a short list.
The right kind of swap.
Never ever been part of a short list like that. That's good.
But to answer your question, I don't tend to follow like what
Yeah.
gets a lot of recommendations for most of the year until it starts piling up.
Do
And
you feel a quiet hostility towards really, really well-reviewed novels
Sometimes.
that also are sort of popular with readers?
yeah, and certainly the stakes are much higher. I'll start reading it, and I'll either I'm so eager to be confirmed in my disdain for it that if it's gonna prove itself to me and have me be like, yeah, this is actually justifiably well reviewed, then it has to be pretty spectacular.
All right, let's take some questions from the audience.